Hello and welcome back. Today we're going to be jumping into GameMaker and we're going to be working on getting the camera to follow around the player. So traditionally the way we would have done this would be going over to our room. In this case, I'm going to do it with the testing room. We don't need anything in the properties for the layer. Instead, for room settings, we want to enable viewports. Make sure viewport 0 is visible. Normally you would just say follow the player object, but we're gonna do something a little different to have it set up in a kind of a nicer setup in a way that we'd prefer for our stuff. So first, I am going to make my room a little bigger, 2048. That makes it a little longer. And 1024, that makes it a little deeper down, and I'm going to actually decrease the size of my viewport to be 512 and 512. Maybe make this a little longer. Now that looks good enough. With this, we now have a larger room. In order to make better use of everything, I'm going to be moving around some of my objects to compensate for this. Let me see. Wall layer. Let me move this around just to make better use of the larger space. And there we go. We've got a little bit more stuff to play around with, a much larger room. Now, whenever I run the game, because we don't have anything else set up to properly follow along, the camera is going to stay in the top left corner in this little viewport area, but we are going to, of course, not be able to do anything. The camera's not following us. It doesn't look that great. So this is where we need to go in and address creating a new object that controls how the camera moves. I'm going to create a new object. And let's minimize this and this. This is going to be obj_camera. It doesn't have a sprite. And we're going to have two events. We're going to have a create event. We're going to have a step event. And so let me go ahead and maximize this, increase the size so everyone can read it. So inside here, we're going to first set up our camera in the create event for our camera object. We're going to, of course, create the camera, and we're going to make sure we can grab this viewport camera 0. With this here, we can then semicolon, go ahead, jump in and work on the next part of specify what we're going to follow. We're going to follow the player object. Make sure we save that. And then we're going to create a couple more variables to keep track of things. So we've created our variable for the camera, grabbing the viewport. And we specify what object we're going to be following. We're following, of course, the player object. Then we're going to go ahead and create 4 more variables to keep track of different values that we'll be referencing later on. So we're going to check to see what is half of our width, view W for width half, and this is going to be equal to the camera dot get, or sorry, not dot, underscore get view width. And this camera, we're going to divide it by 2. Copy and paste this, change it to view H for horizontal half, and this will be the height. Or sorry, not H for horizontal, it's H for height. Now that we have the halves for our camera view, get the X value that we're trying to move to. We're just going to have our starting X value, and our Y value to is going to just be our Y starting value. Now that we have these variables set up, we can go into our step event and actually update camera position. With this area, we'll have to do a couple of parts. We're going to first update the destination. Update our object position. And then finally, update the camera view. So to update the position, we need to check first if our instance exists. We, of course, don't want to be following the player if the player has died. So whatever we're trying to follow, if it exists, then our x2 is going to be the x value of whatever we're following, and our y2 is going to be the y value of whatever we're trying to follow. With this, we then just update our object position. Our x is going to be plus equals our x2 minus our actual x value divided by 25. Our y plus equals y2 minus the y value divided by 25. So similar to how we had set up the menu to move around back and forth and have the nice one line to determine the position, this does the same thing. It creates a kind of slow movement towards where we currently are. The greater the distance, the greater the movement is going to be. But as we get closer, eventually these two will close out to be 0, as this will be the same as where it currently is, and it won't move at all. So that way, if somehow we get very far away from the camera is going to move faster to our position, versus if we are very close to where the camera is supposed to be, it'll move slower. But we want to make sure that we don't accidentally go out of bounds and have the camera look outside of the space that we want. So our x value is going to be equal to, and we're going to see a new function, clamp. Clamp is going to keep us locked inside of a certain space. So if our x value is greater than, less than view half, or greater than, the width minus view half, then it forces it in there. We actually do the same thing for the y value. If our y value is less than half of our height, but also, or it is greater than the room height minus half of our camera view, because we want to make sure the camera stays centered around the player object. If it goes out of these bounds, it forces it back inside. Then finally, last, you want to make sure you set the camera position to be looking at. So this camera is going to be looking at our current X and Y value, slightly shifted. So that way we're centered in here. Now that we have the code, we should be able to go over to our room, throw our object in here. Wherever this is actually where the camera will start. So depending on what you want to do, maybe you want to have it at the opposite end and then it'll zip over to where the player is. Otherwise, you can just start it off on the player and that's where it'll be. So go to testing room and we see it moves over to us and it nicely moves around and follows us. I'll play around with some of the dimensions to make it look not super zoomed in, but maybe you like that look. It's up to you. Maybe you can increase the size of the viewport, but with this, we can see the camera nicely follows around the player as they move around. As we move further, you saw how quickly the camera moves compared to how slowly it moves here. If I drop down a bit, it's a slow gradual move. If I jump down, it's much quicker. And there we go. We now have our camera set up. And so anytime in the future, whenever you create a new room, you throw in your player in there, and then you simply throw in this camera object in there as well. This way we stay centered unless we're of course at the edge of a room such as we are there. If you have any questions or anything else, just let me know. Otherwise, that's all we've got for this one. Everyone have a good one, and I will see y'all next time.